This is Matt Marino, and you are listening to the Reformed Classicalist podcast, where classical Christian theology, philosophy, and ethics are being retrieved for a new reformation. If you like what you hear, check out the website at thereformedclassicalist.com and go to the YouTube channel to share, like, and subscribe. Also, make sure to review this podcast and leave 5 stars on iTunes, Spotify, or whatever you listen to your podcast on. So, thanks for listening. As you can see, the episode number 1 is What is a Reformed Classicalist? I threatened people that I would be doing a podcast. I'd be ready to go. It's never going to be perfect if you wait for music, especially. And I'm especially looking at people right now who have the ability to help me out with that and have not so far. But anyway, if you wait for perfection in that regard, then you're never going to get anything going. So I am just going to get it going with this question. Oh, by the way, why this choice of topic versus others? It's going to be like this for the first, I'd say, half a dozen. And then I actually have an idea for some mini-series where I'll be looking at classical texts in theology especially, but some philosophy and ethics as well. But, why these first couple questions? Well, I've done these questions before in other formats, but let's face it, they're cringe. And I don't like cringe, and neither do you. So I'm going to do this in a slightly more laid-back context, which for some reason will be less cringy. But I have questions that I'll be flashing to everyone. Every once in a while, I'll have a graphic. I like graphics. I like circles. I like doing that stuff. And so the question today is, what is a Reformed Classicalist? That's an appropriate one to do at first. And I want to say right up at the front, it's not Reformed Classicist. So I saw somebody make that mistake. When a classicist is somebody who's an expert in the ancient classics, not just the humanities, but specifically they're looking at ancient texts in the original Greek, Latin, etc. I want to make use of those texts, but that's not what I do. I know just enough Greek, Hebrew, and Latin to get by, especially Greek and Hebrew, just because I've been preaching the scriptures for over 2 decades. But no, I'm not a classicist, okay? I know it's hard to say and write, but classical ist. But the question is, what on earth does that mean? Or maybe that's not your question, but that's a question for some people, so I want to answer it for some people. So what do I mean first by classical? Because I don't mean a whole world view. Certainly not reinventing any wheel. We're going to talk about the word retrieval when I get to it. When you talk about classical, usually when you use that adjective, people have in their mind, things like Mozart and Bach or whatever. The word can attach itself to all sorts of things, not just philosophy and theology, but even things like architecture, obviously music, we just mentioned that. But the idea behind the word is that it signifies something that is great, something that is the best. Usually people would just mean it as a synonym for traditional or historical. We want to say more than that. We're not just after some kind of genealogy of ideas, or we're not for digging up the past for the sake of, well, it's tried and true, so let's check our brains at the door here, just like people do today, but we'll just check our brains at the door back there. Some people do that, and that can be faddish. And people get accused of that, and a lot of people live up to that caricature, and that's not what we're doing at all. But there is something to be said for something that is tried and true, that's withstood the test of time. But these are the great books. Somebody can say, well, who gets to make them great? Who gets to say that? Well, let's just erase it, because I hear this all the time, even about classical schools. It's about the tools of learning, recovering the lost tools of learning, not so much the content. Well, hold on right there. Yeah, we want to create self-learners, but it actually does matter what you think. Classicalism, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that there was actually a classical way of looking at things. And I mean it just like that. They tended to look at things. They tended to look outside of their own minds toward the world. It was a more objective outlook. The way a lot of people would say it today, especially if you're into philosophy, is it was a metaphysical outlook. This was before the Enlightenment. People tended to define their world from the top down and from the outside in. It was not subjective. It was not relative. The world was not a projection of your mind or your will. That's something that happens after Kant, and especially in the last 2 centuries. And theology is not immune to that. And so we and I'll use the word, we'll do another subject, another episode on worldview, because I think I have opinions about that. I think people in the classical retrieval world can throw the baby out with the bathwater there. But as far as classical, I've got a picture here, and I want to make a strong claim about content, right? I want to make a strong claim about metaphysics and a basic way of looking at the world. And here's the way I would put it. Back in the time from really Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, contrary to the Sicilian in The Princess Bride, they were not morons. They were pagans, but because of general revelation, they can get some things right. It was Alfred North Whitehead that once said that all philosophy in the West has been a footnote to Plato. Well, that's an overstatement. However, the basic questions that they were asking, Plato and Aristotle, are the ones that remain. Different answers. And so there's a Christian correction, not just a baptizing them in Christianese, as you often hear about Augustine or about Thomas Aquinas. Well, that's not the case at all. It was a critical appropriation of their view. But you know what? For all the differences that Plato and Aristotle had with each other, or you could say Augustinian or a Thomistic view has with each other, and by the way, there's a reason I call this classicalism and not Augustinianism, for example, which I could have, or Thomism. You hear about Reformed Thomism. And that really could be accused of faddishness. But the other problem with it is it's somewhat truncated. Those thinkers, no matter how great, didn't say everything. And there's something to be said for the others, that they contributed and rounded out the picture, filled it in, so to speak. But anyway, for all of their differences, what they would have all agreed on against the modern and the postmodern view, you see it over on the left, is that as you looked out at your world, you see that circle? That's your world. It's permeable, by the way. Because above that line, i.e. above the outside of that circle, you had more real. So the words more real go together. But you notice that more is above the line. The supernatural or metaphysical outlook, rookie mistake there, is not saying that physical nature, the material world, is not real. Now that's one of the knocks on Plato. We'll get to specifics in future episodes. But these guys in the classical world would have said, look, number one, the real world is more real than me. And you and I can talk about it. That is, there's a common field outside of it. That's another thing. The word objective. See, if you don't have an objective outlook on things, you're going to start, misdefining the word objective, which is what the Enlightenment started to do, but we really blew it open at the turn of the 21st century. Here we are under the effects of postmodernism, and we use the word objective to mean another form of subjectivity. How many times do you see it in any book on any subject? Oh, so-and-so thinks he has an objective view. What do they mean by that? Well, a privileged perspective. The right way. I see from my perspective, or I am dispassionate. My perspective does not affect the data, blah, blah, blah. What do all that have in common? That's just another form of subjectivity. Exalting itself, to be sure, but that's not what the word objective means in this context. Okay. So the classical view would be defined by these two things. It has an epistemology. That's another error. Plato, Aristotle, well, there's no epistemology. Epistemology became the focus of modern philosophy. Well, it became the fixation as it turned the world inside out. They didn't use the word back then, but they had an epistemology. They had a theory of how you know, or how you know that you know. But they subordinated that to metaphysics, to the real world outside of me. Outside of me comes first. That which is bigger than me, that's been around, that's permanent, unchangeable, that defines, that determines that which is more changeable. And finally, me and my outlook. So those two things. Reality's real, it's knowable. Get to the modern world, you start to demote metaphysics to physics, and when you do that, it's been talked about, postmodernism bills itself as a criticism of modernism, getting behind the Enlightenment. But actually, some better thinkers have noted that postmodernism is just a logical extension of modernism. Okay, that's another episode for another day too, but here's the point to catch, is that the modern and the postmodern mind would go from saying that What is more real is not real. Now this down here is real. For Kant, he started by saying, well, we can't know the real, that is the essence of things, the thing in itself. Our experience is limited to the world of appearances. Now you see this horizontal line going from his eyes outward. Well, as things move on in the 19th century with idealism, then the only world, quote unquote, that we can talk about is the one that's projected from our minds or wills or from this culture or that culture, etc., etc. You know the drill. So when I hear a scholar, and I do hear this, oh, you can't word the word classical, well, it wasn't monolithic. You hear this attack on, well, even the phrase, the great tradition, is suspect. Okay, fine. Let's use the word classical. Well, the word classical, there's not one. Oh my goodness. How do you, I don't understand how these people get up in the morning, to be very honest with you. We know what the word classical means. I'm going to use the word to mean the basic outlook before the Enlightenment came and ruined everything. In terms of metaphysics and whatever. Now, that which was good in the Enlightenment, by the way, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, are Christian ideas that were hijacked and perverted. So you've got two different extremes on that. One of which says the Enlightenment was all bad, one of which says the Enlightenment is all good, or at least, and it's a rejection of Christianity. No, it's Christianity coming to full flower on the other side, and they're both wrong. The Enlightenment is a rotten, more, I would not say flowering that wilted. I would say more like a rotten fruit, but I would say more like the worm that got into the fruit. Yeah, let's go with that. And that matters for how you start interpreting the words that were used at that time. But all that to say, by classical, I mean that basic, objective, realist outlook. I'll do shows on each of these terms, explaining it in Plato's view, in Aristotle's view, in Augustine, in Thomas Aquinas, and so on, and then what was lost, why realism lost, etc. But the classical outlook is a basically metaphysical outlook. How does that apply to theology? Well, it applies in this way. We understand the world from God first. That's number one. Number two, we understand God in terms of God in himself first, and only secondarily, God for us. Now that's going to be a reversal from various modern theologies, some of which affect the house of Reformed theology, whether it be Bardianism, or whether it be theistic personalism, narrative personalism, biblicism, the flow of the text from left to right, which is really just a methodological way to embrace theistic personalism, as it turns out. Those go together like a hand in a glove. But all of them have this, in common. They would have a rejection of a metaphysical view of God. Okay? Now, there's a lot there. But that's essentially what I'm going to mean by classical. It's not about flag chasing. It's not about fads. It's not about a team. I'm Augustinian. I'm more Thomistic. Some people would say I'm more Scotist and whatever. Who are these people? But they're there if you want to be really obscure into that debate, which we'll get into because it's important for the story of how realism lost and so on. So that's classicalism. And the Reformed classicalism brings up the question of, what do you mean by Reformed, and does that even go together with any of this? And because a lot of people see that to be Reformed is to be anti-classical, which I'll come to. But first you have to get the idea that to be Reformed is not anti-historical. You hear the statement, it was coined by John Henry Newman, who converted from Anglicanism to Roman Catholicism. And if you hear me say Romanism, it's precisely to make the point which I'm about to make, because he said that to be deep in history is to cease to be Protestant. And he was capturing what on a popular level resonates for a lot of people. But it's a false impression. There's the whole, Brother Martin, where was your church before, that whole thing. Well, if you listen to their arguments, Luther and especially Calvin in the Institutes, they don't just quote Scripture, which they did hold above everything else in terms of the authority, which, by the way, the great Catholic thinkers did too, if you actually take the trouble to read them. But they made arguments from history. Calvin is always quoting Bernard, but even further back, even where he disagrees with Irenaeus. And of course, he's quoting pagans too, like Plato and Cicero at various points. But he's quoting Augustine. He's quoting all these early church fathers, John Chrysostom. He's disagreeing with them here, but he's agreeing with them there, which you have to do if you actually read them instead of just cherry picking or doing your research online or whatever else. So the Reformation was not a rejection of Catholicity. In fact, that whole famous expression, in this case, it would be, I didn't leave the Catholic Church. The Roman Church left Catholicity. And of course, Roman Catholic as a term is a square circle. Catholicity means universality. Rome is a physical locale. And if you want a physical locale that's the central type in Scripture, it was Jerusalem that was the eternal city, not Rome. Rome was Babylon. But aside from that, it's a square circle. The universality of the church defies physicality, defining things from the ground up or from matter outward in a naturalistic fashion. The Reformation argued, whether you agree with their argument at all or not, we can have that conversation, but don't rewrite history. Their argument was that Roman Catholicism, papism, many of them called it, was a late medieval development. It crystallized, really, between the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 to the Council of Trent as a reaction to the Reformation. But they were steeped in history. You can make assessments about whether their arguments were correct, but you can't argue that they were not like the 19th century frontier sectarians that said that the true church went away sometime around, Nicaea, and requires some modern day prophet to hear private revelation. That's not at all, and oftentimes the reformers were arguing against such people. So, number one, don't rewrite history. The Reformation was not a rejection of Catholicity, but then we want to get to the question that's more maybe pertinent to this particular episode and the name. What about people that say, not so much that it was against Catholicity, but wasn't the Reformation a repudiation of all things classical? I mean, Luther had strong language for Aristotle, and oftentimes the others would criticize it, and sometimes, more rarely, there were criticisms of scholasticism. Calvin, here or there, did so. Maastricht did as well. But there you'd have to make a distinction between the good scholastics and the bad scholastics, or good examples of scholasticism and bad examples. And this has been chronicled about Calvin in Steinmetz and Muller and others, and about Luther in Gerisch and most recently Jordan Cooper and others. So it's simply mythology that, even granting Luther's less sober moments, criticizing Aristotle and so on, you have to understand that in a particular context, in a particular mode in which he wrote. But in addition to that, there's a misunderstanding about, the magisterial reformers were writing on the run. They were writing polemically, but they were writing as reforming pastors who, by the way, had wars on their border, and oftentimes they themselves were on the run, in Luther's case. They were not the systematizers, not yet. That would come. Looking little by little, by Vermigli and Musculus and others in the first generation, but more it would happen later on, starting with Junius and Paulinus and others, and then eventually you have the century of Reformed scholasticism. And so, no, they were not rejecting classical modes of thought or methods in terms of scholasticism, and that's more medieval, but in terms of classical thinking, it's no coincidence that once you have the mode and the method going, well, you're also going to have the metaphysic. And so you had all sorts of people from Johannes Alsted to Junius. Of course, Junius, if he lived longer, perhaps would have written more on it. But Turretin, even in small sections at the beginning of his Institutes in Volume 1 and others, and lesser-known works that are going to come out, we're going to talk about that a little bit, talked about metaphysics. And so it wasn't just that Vermigli wrote a commentary on Aristotle's Ethics or things like that, or even Calvin going back to more humanistic methods in people like Calvin. You know, it's his first writing was a commentary on Seneca's De Clementia. And you think, well, that was pre-conversion Calvin, or pre-reformer Calvin at least. Okay, fine. But what did he say about Plato and the soul, and Cicero? And what did Junius take from Aquinas, just as Richard Hooker did as well, on natural law? And so on and so on and so on. And why were they always using the language of these four causes, as Aristotle did? Shouldn't they have just come up with different names for them? You know, there's such a superstition, you know, that we Protestants can have sometimes. And it's I notice it's not really Protestants, it's more of a vulgar evangelicalism, really, that comes up with this. It's the same mentality that says, can we call it Resurrection Day instead of Easter? Which, by the way, I do. I've got no problem with that. But you're just oftentimes running from one superstition into the arms of another. This fear-driven, oh no, that's dirty, you know, about what Paul did on Mars Hill. So no, the Reformation was not a repudiation of all things classical. And I think it's very instructive that of all those Latin works that were not translated, of which there are like 95% or more, and so they're still being, you know, in the 20th century, when Reformed theology was eking out in the form of the Puritans by Banner of Truth through J.I. Packer, Martin Lloyd-Jones, and then eventually the New Calvinism at the turn of the millennium, in the works that were being rediscovered by a new generation, not because they weren't in English, they were in English already. But what were those works? Those were works that were typically dealing with God, as they should, and the gospel, and the practical Christian life. You know, the Puritan paperbacks, and that's good. That's at the core of it, it should be. But conspicuously missing were always, in every case, the works on the bookends, philosophy and ethics, or metaphysics and ethics, or in other words, why do you believe and so what? Doctrine's the middle. We'll talk about it in a second. And this actually changes the kind of Christianity that you call Christianity. And so very, very, very interesting, because it raises the question, when that happens, I now have a new slide up. Well, what's so wrong with 20th century Reformed theology that such a retrieval would actually be necessary, and especially in our tradition? And that word, maybe you're not familiar with that word, retrieval. Retrieval theology, sometimes the word ressourcement is used. It's been used in other traditions before, but, all this time, while the new Calvinism was going on, it wasn't just that R.C. Sproul was the lone voice in the wilderness, which he was on a popular level, but there were scholars doing the work. Richard Muller, most famously, but most of us, we took longer to catch up. We didn't know who he was, what he was doing, and we found out later. And other guys have been doing stuff here and there that, one day I'll do an episode on retrieval theology and different resources that are the best to look into. But the idea is to go back and to essentially avoid being biblicists. That needs an episode. That needs a whole series. That needs a book. Because biblicism is not a high view of Scripture. Biblicism is not a synonym for sola scriptura. Biblicism is an atomistic and anti-intellectual, anti-metaphysical, not just anti-historical, which it is that. Because some people would say, I'm not a biblicist, I believe in the creeds and confessions. Okay, that's good. That's a good first start. Now you need about 9 more things that you're not aware that your mind is imposing on the text or ignoring in the totality of the text. And there are various mind blocks that prevent you from actually doing theology in a systematic fashion. So it's not just anti-historical, it's anti-metaphysical, which we have a lot of work to do to explain what that means. Why do we need it so much? What happened in 20th century theology? I keep using the words biblicism. I used the words before, theistic personalism. There were basically 2 main strands in post-war Reformed theology. One was more what we would regard to be more on the left, which would be Barthianism after the theology of Karl Barth. And then others would be the more conservative forms of Reformed theology in which Van Til and Van Tillianism triumphed. And immediately a lot of preceptors will say, well, yeah, but there was a Gordon Clark wing and you need to read him too and blah, blah, blah. Fair enough. Okay, there's distinctions to be made there. But what all of them would have in common is this essential rejection of a metaphysical way of looking and a very superstitious rejection of extra-biblical sourcing and thinking and framing of categories, which is just a problem is it's the human way to think, and when you try to suppress that, that's going to lead to problems even on the doctrinal level. So what essentially happened in 20th century theology, not in terms of figures, because I don't care to pick on names and people so much, but it's the ideas behind them that we should care about. I've used this picture before, I'll use it again. And here are those bookends. I say bookends, I'll explain what I mean by that a little bit more in a second. But you can get your doctrine right in the middle. But, I've compared it to a sandwich before. You can get the meat of your doctrine. There's a lot of Reformed theologians today that will get right doctrine. But if your bread is moldy, you're not going to want to touch that meat. And eventually the rot will spread. Okay, well, how do you get there? Well, the opposite of that are these two ideas with the word natural in it. And the problem is something that I have called elsewhere the soteriological critique of nature. And we have to do a whole episode on that because, just in a nutshell, the word natural and the concept of nature begin to be reduced to soteriology alone. And you see this with sort of a modern post 1900 Reformed theology that reduces every question to the 5 points and all this stuff, and what that does with categories like the image of God and common grace, and mostly this word natural. If I hear the word natural, well, natural man is that. You see what you did there? And they do it on every conceivable subject, so that the objective nature of things gets morphed into the prospects of post-lapsarian man and how we can perform with that thing at attaining our chief end. That's not what the word means. It's not what the word ever meant. And good thinkers were able to separate the objective nature of things, yes, even when you're talking to an unbeliever, but especially when we're carving out our method for doing theology in everything else. So these words, natural theology, natural law, if you take Paul seriously, there is a knowledge that all mankind has that is retained after the fall. Yes, we cast it onto the wall in the shadows of idolatry, etc. Nevertheless, we could not have suppressed a knowledge that we did not have. Okay, those are episodes right there. But the Barthian wing and the Van Tillian wing, some for common reasons, some for different reasons, said no, there is no revelation of God back behind Christ in nature. That's Barth talking. No, there is no autonomous ground for the natural knowledge of God outside of Scripture. That's Van Til talking. But do you see what they have in common? And so you had this rejection of natural theology and natural law that first had to really butcher the meaning of those terms, as is evident in all of their authors. And again, it's not to pick on them, it's to point out what happened. And again, that bread. When you start to compromise the very nature of truth, the fact that something can be true when a believer says it, but not when an unbeliever says it, comes perilously close and starts to lead directly to the double truth theory that was held by Averroes in the Middle Ages, or like the neo-Orthodox dialectical theology, where contradiction is even a hallmark of the truth, of spirituality, of faith, as Emil Brunner and others would argue. That has an effect. And I would say to people, a lot of people didn't catch this, but during R.C. Sproul's debate with Greg Bahnsen, which good luck listening to it, it's very tough to listen to. The audio is very coarse, if you can even find it online. And one of the things Sproul said in his opening statement, if I go long in this first episode, it just is what it is. I'm yapping. Why does Reformed Classicalism matter? Well, one of the things Sproul said in the introductory statement, and it might have been missed because it's not. Because who cares? Because if you're a presuppositionalist, or even if you're a classicalist, and you think the debate is all about apologetics, then you're not going to appreciate what Sproul was getting at here. And maybe you're thinking that he's straw manning the Van Tillian position or whatever. But he said he had two basic concerns, and apologetic encounters were not one of them. Doesn't mean that he wasn't also concerned about that. But he said it's two basic concerns. If we embrace this, if this becomes the long-term Reformed position of denying natural theology and natural law, then we will be on the road to something like a neo-orthodox or a double theory of truth. That's number one. But then number two, if we lose natural law, we'll lose an objective foundation for ethics. And we'll lose Western civilization. And you think, so he's basically saying you're a relativist and you're going to lose civilization. You're on the side of the relativists and the barbarians if you reject reform, what I call Reformed Classicalism. And the answer is yes. That's the claim. And so there has to be, there was a chapter heading actually in the book Classical Apologetics, co-authored by Sproul, Gerstner, and Lindsley, that said the reconstruction of natural theology. And I would just add to that the reconstruction of the natural knowledge of God and of objective nature, really the reconstruction of nature and reason, which is why my dissertation is called God, Reason, and Nature. We have to answer the call put out in that book to reconstruct those foundations in thought. And there's, of course, a nervousness. That's more foundational than Scripture. And so there's, how they come to this idea of autonomous reason and what mistakes fire off in their mind when they, and what do they hear when they're hearing that? These are all good questions, and they're the kind of things I want to answer and dissect and make charts to, just like my other charts on this show. But I was explaining to you the bookends. If you reject that the world is, including you the subject, are also an object. Man has a nature. And it doesn't matter that the unbeliever doesn't agree with the particular meaning to this term or that term. That's a separate question. That's why it's Reformed Classicalism. We agree with you about the need for regeneration, to see things spiritually. But we beg to differ that affects the truth itself and the manner in which we ought to point to the truth, even if we're talking to an unregenerate person. But certainly, I'm not going to let the unregenerate determine whether or not I talk about these things as things. But especially when we're then in the house, and I use the house analogy a lot of times as a metaphor for system building. Here, when we're talking about system building, we are doing a decidedly Christian enterprise. Why on earth would you bring up the unregenerate at this point? At this point, now, we're talking about system building and the need to understand antecedent truths about God. You see it in even your exegesis of Scripture. And we'll do episodes that give examples of this. But it is no coincidence, for example, that those that struggle the most with classical metaphysical categories are also the people that struggle with the incommunicable attributes of God. And in particular, ones like simplicity and aseity, and especially impassibility, or even ones that you don't put on that list but are implications like pure actuality. And they struggle with these things, or even concepts that are adjacent to this, like the analogy of being. And Barth called it the invention of the Antichrist. And it's just, if you dump these concepts, your doctrine of God is not going to stay together though you may slap like Band-Aids onto a bursting dam, all the proof texts you want, they have to mean something. And if these foundations are not there, if they're quicksand, if you dismiss them altogether, that's going to lead to cracks in the building in due time. And we don't expect lay people to understand all of this, but the system builders, this is what we're talking about here. If the system builders turn to irrationality, to nonsense, well, then the house of doctrine's not going to stand in due time. It's going to disintegrate. So I think I already answered that next question I had on there, which was what is retrieval or resourcement theology, but it is worth noting that I will address it sometimes critically on this podcast, because I think some who are doing it as a hobby horse or as an intellectual trip. There is faddishness. There is also academic respectability and this craving for acceptance or for a spot at the cool kids table or whatever it may be. And so you're embarrassed by this or that thing in culture. Usually it's an embarrassment over something that's perceived as anything right of center, anything on that side of the Overton window, I guess where you are, that'd be that side of the Overton window. And therefore, if there's something in the older thinkers that supports those positions now regarded as unpopular in the culture, well, those are the ones we're going to shut up. Those are the ones we're not going to publish, which, of course, leads to further questions, such as this one. Who gets to decide? I've seen this debate pop up recently for a variety of reasons. And, if your criticism is, hey, I'm worried about AI, and I'm worried that anybody just, hey, let me tell you, I sympathize. If this is really your concern, and your concern is, I don't want to go on Amazon, order a book, and find out it's some second-rate blah, blah, blah with no footnotes, and it turns out it's a bad translation, and yada, yada, yada. And it's not aesthetically pleasing either, or whatever else. Yeah, hey, I'm right there with you. I don't think that's where this criticism is coming from. I think this criticism is coming from a group that wants to be the new elite. And they don't want, they're very uncomfortable. And you say, yeah, well, I can produce X amount of examples of people using these things for nefarious purposes. I don't give a rat's rear end what you can come up with. They can say the same thing, and they did, about the reformers. So I don't want to hear any of that garbage, because you sound like the Pope, basically. And I want to caution anybody to not just use AI if that's what you're doing, or if you're just learning Latin look, my Latin is not great. I'm not going to translate. I'm going to leave that up to the experts. While I try to keep improving at Latin. I'm not going to translate anything anytime soon. I mean, if that's what you're worried, if you're worried about excellence, if that's really what you're worried about, I'm right there with you. But if you're nervous because the dam is about to break open on all those untranslated works, and we're gonna find out what Junius and Dano and some of the ones coming out. Anthony Burgess has stuff that. On natural theology and natural law, and I can go on and on and on. If you're nervous that that's going to lead people to views that are very illiberal, as you define it, from an Enlightenment perspective, an American perspective, a post-World War II perspective, if that's how you want to label it, if that's your concern, oh no, people are going to read things and have to think for themselves, then I have no sympathy for you whatsoever. I want the fullest amount of text to come out. And if you're so worried about people not having a guide them. Get a podcast. That's what I'm going to do, and that's part of what I'm going to use this for. I'll leave you with this. I love this passage. You say, how do you justify this Reformed classicalism and retrieval theology, and even the method of teaching in a class? You're going to teach in a classical college. You're just going to read old texts. Well, Jesus said this in Matthew 13. I'll leave you with this. Therefore, every scribe who has been trained for the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house who brings out of his treasure what is new and what is old. You say, that's just talking about Scripture, is it? I'll give you this. It's principally talking about Scripture. It's talking about the relationship between the Old Covenant and the New, the Old Testament, and creation, really. But the moment you go there and you say, well, does it stop at Exodus 19? Or does it go back? Well, Genesis 12, he announces it to Abraham. Okay, so the scribe of the kingdom doesn't cover Genesis 1 through 11? Well, he does that because that's Scripture too. And what does that Scripture say about stuff? Is Scripture just talking about itself like a hall of mirrors? Or is it talking about stuff? Reality? See, there's the debate. It gives you a hint of what Biblicism is. Being a Reformed Classicalist is about being a scribe of the kingdom, not just reconciling old to new, but reconciling nature to Scripture, reconciling your brain to the real world with the help of older texts. So I'll cut it there, and we're going to do this for about half a dozen episodes, and then I've got a mini series in mind. And I won't say I won't say the first book I'm going to review is going to be Augustine's On Christian Doctrine, but it's going to be Augustine's On Christian Doctrine. But we've got about 5 other subjects at least that we've got to cover first as a preliminary matter. So I hope you like this idea. I have no idea how long I went. Like and subscribe and share and support this project.